Thanks for listening to that technical orientation. Let me once again officially welcome everybody to the Conservation Finance Forum. Cross-cutting conservation at local and regional scales is today's theme. This event is assisted by the Ash Center's Government Innovators Network. And I'd like to turn things over to our moderator today, Jim Levitt, who is the Director of the Program on Conservation Innovation at the Harvard Forest, Harvard University. Mr. Levitt.
Good morning to all of you. We are broadcasting live from beautiful Cambridge, Massachusetts, where it is sleeting and freezing rain. We have in the room with us today Matt Zeiper from the Trust for Public Land, and by telephone Mathew Jacobson from the International Boreal Conservation Campaign, sponsored by the Pew Charitable Trust. I will get back to our guests in a minute, but a couple of introductory remarks to familiar names on the call today. There are 61 of you online right now, and some new names, which I always love to see. First of all, I want to send to all of our friends in Chile who are either online today or who will check in asynchronously our prayers and our wishes for you. We were just down in your beautiful country a year ago, and the sun was shining and everything looked good. You've, of course, been through a tragedy in the last couple of days, and anything that we can do to help on a personal level or as conservationists, we would please invite you to let us know. Just for anyone who happened to have been in Valdivia last year, as far as I know, everyone who was at that conference is safe and sound today, and that is very good news. Today we're going to focus on cross-cutting conservation strategies at the local and regional scales and ways to finance such strategies. As I said before, we have two guests who are very well qualified to talk about that topic. It's a topic that was covered in the book that has come from the Chile conference, which was recently published and announced in the newsletter that you all recently received, published by the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy in collaboration with the Ash Center at the Kennedy School, with the David Rockefeller Center for Latin American Studies at the Kennedy School, and with Island Press. It's a book that you can get directly from the Lincoln Institute, or alternatively from Island Press or online booksellers such as Amazon.com. One of the discussions that we're going to have today from Matt Zeiper is actually written up very concisely and with very clear logic by Matt Zeiper, the Community Preservation Act example, and a number of other exemplary cases of conservation finance both in South and North America. Today we are going to try to begin what I think will be a long conversation that will go over many sessions about conservation across boundaries, that is, across parcel boundaries, across public, private, nonprofit, and academic sectoral boundaries, and even across national boundaries. The challenge before the conservation community as we log more and more successes in protecting land is how to bring the human capital, the social capital, the natural capital, and the financial capital that's been invested in these projects together to achieve measurable qualitative and quantitative results, beneficial results related to biodiversity habitat, ecosystem service provision, the sustainable production of commodities, and the protection and enhancement of treasured amenities. And I think both of the Matts that we have online today will be able to speak to the scenario in which we envision thoughtful management of mosaics of conserved land, geo-environmental quality, well-being for the communities which exist within them and around them, and measurable economic value. So with that, let me first introduce Mathew Zeiper. Matt is a graduate of the University of Massachusetts and the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard. He has served for the last decade as the Director of Research for the Conservation Finance Program at the Trust for Public Land. Matt Jacobson and anybody else who is listening tonight, let me ask you please to mute your telephones so that we don't hear any paper ruffling or whatever on the background as Matt Zeiper is talking, and then we'll log you in. So with that, let me ask Matt Zeiper. Matt, as you begin your presentation, can you tell us a little bit about how you personally got interested in the field of conservation and conservation finance?
Sure. Thanks very much, Jim. I work at the Trust for Public Land, which is a national nonprofit conservation organization. I happen to be based in Massachusetts. We work all over the United States. My own personal interest in working in conservation comes from both direct experience with land conservation organizations on the ground here in Massachusetts, as well as a background earlier in my career working in the state legislature and for a fiscal and economic policy think tank, which looked at how do governments fund all kinds of services, and an area of personal interest being land conservation. And I happen to work at a unique spot where we are actively advancing public policies that help create new conservation lands in the United States.
So Matt, can you tell us a little bit about the subject that we brought you in for today, which is the Community Preservation Act, an innovation in conservation finance, which has spread across the Commonwealth of Massachusetts at a remarkable rate over the past 12 years? Has it been?
About a decade.
About a decade.
This is it's now about 10 years, but it's somewhat of I don't want to say an overnight success that took 20 years or so to happen. The slide you're looking at here, this introduction slide, shows just little snapshots of the types of resources. And the Community Preservation Act, and we're focused on land conservation here today, uniquely funds historic preservation, affordable housing, open space, and recreation projects. And so these four little pictures, and while we're not focused on affordable housing or on historic resources today, their kind of shared union with land conservation is really what made CPA possible in a pretty densely urban state like Massachusetts, and it's what allows the preservation of natural resources to take place. So I'm going to jump in here. Just going to give one little background on the Conservation Finance Program Jim talked about. I'm the research director for the program. We are actively involved in two primary activities. One, creating new public funding on the ground at the state and local government level through legislation and passage of ballot measures. This is really number two here. Everybody can see the pointer? Okay. Can they? No. Sorry, we lost it. Now they can see the pointer. If you click and hold down there. Okay, thank you. We create new public funding. Over the past decade, we've created more than $32 billion for land conservation in America through ballot measures and legislation. We also actively lobby for the passage of these measures. You can see some direct mail pieces here. And the second piece, we are also a think tank. So it's a dual role that we're studying the best practices for funding conservation in America, and we're also doing this work. And CPA, that's the shorthand for the Community Preservation Act, is really at the forefront of the success for funding conservation at a cross-cutting scale in America. On the slide here, the map of America, and you can see a concentration of dots. These are the real centers of activity in the United States for conservation funding. Okay. And you can see circles, one here in the Northeast, one here in the Northeast, this is Massachusetts, one here in New Jersey, another real locus in Colorado, and one down here in Florida. These are places where, and this is at the foundation of the Community Preservation Act, where state and local governments are partnering together to achieve conservation at a scale they can never do on their own. And you can see the concentration of dots is most heavy in those places, not only because they're highly developed areas, and this is something like the map of America at night, where development takes place, but it's also because of that partnership. Okay. Now on to the Massachusetts story. Over the past decade, in one state, nearly 142 cities and towns out of 351, nearly 40% of the cities and towns in this pretty small state have created $500 million in new public investment, the lion's share of that going for land conservation. And what does that offer for other jurisdictions in the United States and hopefully outside the United States? Okay. Now, Massachusetts, as those of you who've been familiar with Jim's work in other venues, Jim Levitt, we are proud of our role as a leader, creating the first public park, the Boston Common, the first land trust, the the trustees of reservation, and the first local land bank on Nantucket Island. Today's Community Preservation Act really stems back about 25 years, where the islands, Martha's Vineyard and Nantucket, had created land banks funded by a real estate transfer tax, which is a tax on the conveyance of real estate, and that was very successful for those island locations. The rest of the Commonwealth quickly saw the success on Nantucket and Martha's Vineyard, and legislators said, we want to emulate that. Let's have a land bank all over Massachusetts at the city and town level. Unfortunately, this ran into organized, well-funded opposition. This is in the legislature, primarily by the realtor community, and for about 20 years it didn't get anywhere based on this transfer tax. Come to 1998, the Cape Cod Land Bank, instead of continuing with this real estate transfer tax model, it shifted gears to something we learned from New Jersey, which was using a property tax, a surcharge on local property tax bills, instead of this tax on the conveyance of real estate. The opposition from the realtor community disappeared with this change in model, and it passed on Cape Cod, which is a resort community some or many of you may know about in southeastern Massachusetts. And then within 2 years' time, 2000, 2001, CPA became law statewide, blah, 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 after this New Jersey approach. Okay. The reason that, one of the reasons that CPA has been very successful, while we're talking about cross-cutting conservation activity, at least in a place like Massachusetts, every single city and town thinks of themselves as a unique and distinct kingdom, if you will. And the appeal of CPA is that 142 cities and towns have passed it, and each one uses it in its own unique way. In Cambridge, where we are, where there's not much land to conserve, they use it primarily for affordable housing. But in remote locations, they may be protecting working cranberry bogs, they may be protecting interconnected bike trails, they may be protecting acres and acres of forest land and riparian corridors. So CPA, it specifically allows cities and towns to fund land conservation, historic preservation, affordable housing, and recreation, making it appealing across the state. It allows, I mentioned a property tax. it allows cities and towns to levy up to a 3% property tax surcharge. So if your property tax bill is $1,000, the city or town, with the approval of voters, can levy a tax up to $30, 3% on that $1,000, for example. And it receives matching funds from the state, and this is really the key. If you adopt this local tax, the state provides reliable matching funds from what's called a document recording fee, which goes on the recording of deeds and mortgages and municipal lien certificates. This is a map of where it has been adopted so far in Massachusetts, and you can see it has been heavily adopted in kind of eastern Massachusetts. Cape Cod is that elbow-looking thing that sticks out into the ocean. Again, many of you may know that. The concentration in western Mass is the Pioneer Valley, which is an active working agricultural area still. And it's been also approved in the kind of 128-495 active high-tech and development corridor. It hasn't been adopted in large areas where it's very rural, central Massachusetts, some parts of western Massachusetts. Now, I talked about a number of these already. One of the keys that we've found to the success of this, it only is approved when voters have a role. Unlike many other funding options that exist, where it's only approved by legislative bodies, this requires voters to cast a vote at a ballot, and because of that, there's widespread participation. Voters want a role in the future direction of their community. The next one here, it allows for towns to bond. They can borrow money, allowing them to assemble the money to do these cross-cutting conservation deals now and spread the repayment using the property tax surcharge money into the future. There's an opt-out provision. After 5 years, cities and towns can get out of this. And there also is a formalized community preservation committee. These are citizens in a city or town, up to 5 to 9 residents, all volunteers, who make the recommendations to the legislative body in the town on how to spend the money. So Jim talked earlier about social capital. The proliferation of this law is really the result of people sitting around tables in town halls and city halls across Massachusetts, thinking about the future direction of their community, deciding how they think the money should be spent, and having the flexibility to do it. Really free from the state directly, let's say meddling, but there are broad state guidelines and then no direct state approvals to spend the money. So the cities and towns get to decide how to spend the money once their legislature, that's a town meeting or a city council, approves it. I'm going to try and wrap up in a minute here. More than $500 million worth of funding has been approved so far. More than 10,000, actually over 11,000 acres of open space has been protected to date, which is very significant in a small state. Here's another slide on some of the cost-cutting types of projects. This here is something called the Border to Boston. It's a bike trail that's stretching from almost the New Hampshire border or the New Hampshire border in towns like Newburyport, all the way down through cities like Peabody, all the way down into Boston, where each town is acting independently. And that's the important thing here. CPA is a locally controlled effort, but cities or towns are allowed to fit into a larger regional framework using their own resources. You can see a picture here of a farm in Westport, Massachusetts in the South Coast area, and this is an example of CPA helping save a farm, and this is a town where there's still significant working agriculture. So, the future of CPA, some of the challenges, The trust fund, the matching funds that go to cities and towns, for the first 7 or 8 years of the law, cities and towns received $1 in match for every dollar they raised. So if you raised $500,000 in your town, the state mailed you a check in October for $500,000. With the popularity of the law, 142 towns adopting, and the real estate market slumping, that match dropped 2 years ago to 70%, last year to 40%, and this year might be around 30%. And it was always feared towns would get out of CPA once the match dropped below 100%, and that has not happened, because anybody following investment returns knows a 30% return is still better than a 0% return, even if it's not a 100% return. The other is, with budget woes facing all cities and towns, it has become harder for them to justify adopting CPA, which is a property tax surcharge. But, on the other hand, cities and towns are getting very creative funding projects that they might otherwise have had to use alternative resources to fund, or they would have gotten left undone. So it's still remaining popular. The last piece is the match has been declining, and there's a desire to bump that up by increasing the deed recording fee, allowing cities to use other funds to match it in addition to a modest property tax surcharge, and finally a desire to allow cities to use CPA to fix recreation facilities, basketball courts, swimming pools, athletic fields, which is outside the realm of what we're talking about here. But the key to CPA's success has been maintaining broad-based political support, even in cities and towns that haven't passed it yet. And finally, the last slide. We are trying to apply the lessons of CPA to get broad-based participation, to make other states look like Massachusetts, to fund these types of conservation activities. We've been a little bit successful. The deed recording fee has proved, or the document recording fee has been used in neighboring Connecticut and Massachusetts to support conservation activities. In New York, the real estate transfer tax, which was our kind of failed early revenue source in Massachusetts, was chosen in New York as an option, which so far it's met with no success. No city or town in Westchester, Putnam County, and the Hudson Valley have used it. We're hoping to get New York to switch gears to the property tax like Massachusetts has. And we're looking at how this property tax could be used to support broad-scale conservation of forest resources in the Chesapeake Bay, in Maryland, Pennsylvania, and Virginia. The cautionary note, CPA took 17 years to become law, and so all of these efforts up there now are out there in the kind of fledgling learning stage. With that, I will stop in fairness of time.
All right, Matt, thank you. I just want to, before turning it over to the other Matt, I just want to underscore a couple of points that Matt Zyper made that are relevant to this idea of cross-cutting strategies. The CPA is notable, I think, partly because it actually allowed a coalition to be built across political boundaries that hadn't been crossed before. That is, the land conservation people finally realized that if they got together with the affordable housing people and the historic preservation people, they could pass an act which would have broad-based implications across the whole economy. And it was that idea, after about 15 years of work, that finally got the thing passed through the Massachusetts legislature. Finally, I just want to underscore the point that Matt made about the trails and also working farmlands that have, based on independent action by towns at the local level, created corridors of either amenities, that is trails, or corridors of working farms that actually cross town boundaries. So the idea is that if you have a funding mechanism that allows you at a town-by-town basis to protect parcels of land. If you work at it thoughtfully, you can hook those up, connect those up to create corridors which bring you to applying conservation principles across parcels and across town boundaries. So that sort of sets the stage at the local level with a successful conservation finance initiative in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. With that, I want to switch over to Matt Jacobson, who also lives in Massachusetts in the town of Amherst, but works on an ongoing basis with a number of Canadian provinces to protect a vast region in northern Canada. So Matt, with that, are you there on the telephone?
I am. Can you hear me?
We can hear you very well, and I think you have the controls to the slideshow.
I hope so.
So take it away, and if not, you can just tell us to click to the next slide, and we will do that for you.
All righty. Well, I'll just ask if now we've got the cover slide up for the presentation. Whoops.
The cover slide is up.
Okay, I just got kicked out.
Of the meeting?
Yeah. I'm just going to click the re-enter meeting button. It should take a second. I don't know why that happened.
All right. Thank you, everyone in the audience, for your patience with this.
Should only take a moment.
High tech. Okay, you just click back on the screen,
Back
Matt.
on. Now I need to get my little thumbnail thing out so I can change slides, and I think we're okay.
All right, take it away. So Matt, let me open with the same question I asked Matt Cipher, which is, how did you get into this business in the first place, leading you to tackle an area as vast as the Canadian boreal forest?
Well, it would be an extremely long story. The shortest version I can tell is that after I graduated college with a degree in English literature and religion, and went on my Thoreauvian quest to the woods, I hiked the Appalachian Trail from Maine to Georgia. Decided I was going to spend the rest of my time protecting the woods, and went in search of the biggest, largest intact forest I could find, and did what was necessary to try to keep them in that state, and worked for several years in Vermont, working on protecting wildlands in Vermont, and then after that got engaged with the campaign to protect the remaining roadless areas on the National Forest System, which was an initiative of the Pew Charitable Trust. I was the field director for that for a while, protected the last third of the remaining unprotected intact forests on the National Forest System in the U.S., and then was drafted to go on to tackle this huge landscape scale project that Pew was working on up in Canada.
Matt?
Yep.
Take it away with your slideshow.
I will do that. Okay, so let me just tell me if did that switch it? I won't ask again, but if that switched it, then that means it's working.
We have the whole Earth catalog right before us.
There you go. Well, that is the perspective for the Pew Environment Group, which is the organization that I work for, and that's working to protect the areas in Canada that we'll be talking about, as well as a number of other projects. And this stems from part of the mission of the Pew Charitable Trust Environment Group, the Pew Environment Group, which is to protect sizable ecosystems with large degrees of intactness and biological diversity. And back in the mid-90s, we worked on an analysis to find out where the last remaining intact forests were in the world. There were large, relatively intact, and in pieces large enough and intact enough to protect the biological diversity and ecological processes that would occur in a naturally functioning forest. And the three that really popped out at us, or will pop out to anyone on the map here, are the boreal forests of Canada, the boreal forests of Russia, and the boreal forests, and the tropical forests of the Amazon. And we looked at those forests, and the next overlay we did on these was to to do an analysis of which of these countries had a stable enough political regimes that if we were to put a large investment into policy reform to protect sizable chunks of these intact forests, where would there be a likelihood that in 10 years the government would be stable enough that those policies would be upheld and adhered to? And we decided to focus largely on Canada, which is where those two criteria intersected. We also have a project going on in Australia, which is not as large as the other forests on the map, but it is sizable, it is large, and there is a reasonably intact political structure there, so that if we can achieve protection for these areas, we can assume that that protection will last for a long degree of time. Which is pretty much the stuff here that we're talking about on this slide, was the opportunities that we saw. That 80% of the forests were wild and in public ownership. In Canada, it's a little different than the U.S. It's held by the Crown rather than by the citizens, but it's still in public ownership, and there is a stable government. There's also strong rights by First Nations. We have good relationships with the First Nations and other Aboriginal communities in Canada that are very engaged in our conservation efforts there. They're also influenced by the markets in the United States, and there is a reasonable interest in the government there of doing the right thing and a fairly conservation-minded public. This here is one of the realities that we face, which is the fact that Canada is extremely multi-jurisdictional. So while the slides will show this great big forest stretching over a large area across an entire continent, the breakdown in jurisdictions and the power of those jurisdictions creates somewhat of a complicated web to work across. For folks who aren't that familiar with Canada, it's much more of a confederacy than a republic, in that each of the provinces have more power over most issues than the federal government, as opposed to the way things are here in the States. And here's just a little cartoon about the cross-jurisdictional policies and powers, particularly over the environment, where the federal government has some degree of regulation, the provinces have a large degree, and then we also have the Aboriginal communities intersecting with both of those. We started with an overall vision for the protection of the boreal forests in Canada. We work with a large group of scientists to do an analysis of what would we really need to protect the ecological integrity, intactness, and functioning of the boreal ecosystems. And essentially the answer we got back from the scientific community was that if we were going to protect the functioning of the ecosystem, we're going to need to protect at least half of it. So we set out a call for protecting 50% of the boreal forest from all industrial activity, and then working to create sustainable development standards in the other 50%, so that activities that happened in the other 50% wouldn't interfere with the protections in the 50% that were being protected. We worked on building support from the stakeholders, people who lived in the community, from industry who operated in the northern forest, from the Aboriginal communities that live there, as well as the Engo community and the conservation interests who were working on protecting the forest. We had some outside agitation, which was working with the market groups that were trying to advance procurement policies that favored ecologically sensitive activities from the extractive industries in the north. And then we work on local adaptation and planning with the communities that live in these forests, with the people who are most affected by the regulations on these forests, and with the provinces that have power over the forest, to work on a local adaptation of the overall framework and implementation through land use planning on the local scale. We did this by forming the Boreal Leadership Council, which is across all of Canada. And we have a large number of First Nations, of industries. There's some timber industries there, as well as energy companies, banks that do ethical investing, conservation organizations, all working together and all of these groups, as well as others since this slide have all signed on to the overall principles of the 50% conservation and sustainable development practices in the other 50%. And by doing this, we were working together to find common answers and common interests with other stakeholders so that we could work to advance solutions to the government rather than putting the government in the middle of a battle between opposing sides and asking them to play referee. Over the years, starting in about 2005 when the campaign really launched, to 2007, I don't have up to 2010, but we've had a high degree of corporate support for the policy for the platform of the BOREAL framework. We have an ever-increasing number of First Nations and other Aboriginal communities who are working with us to advance the principles of the framework, and we have a similarly corresponding number of acres that have been protected, approaching almost 400 million acres of commitment for protected areas. But again, this was a very slow process with slow incremental gains as we built up the critical mass to support the really broad policies of the framework. And after we reached that critical mass, things have really taken off, particularly in the provinces of Ontario and Quebec. This here is a map of Canada. It's a little bit reversed. We've got Canada with colors in it and the United States in gray. Working in Canada is a great challenge for groups that are based in the U.S. It's very hard to get attention on what's going on in Canada. My theory is that it's the only place for Americans that is neither exotic nor domestic. And I think that after all of the conditioning of seeing Canada as a gray area above the United States, it makes it very difficult to get Americans interested, although maybe that'll turn around with the hockey game in the Olympics. This is the forest lands in Canada. And the next map shows the boundaries of the relative boundaries of what is the boreal forest of Canada. The next slide, the dark green, shows the intact forest areas, and it's a tremendous amount. It's about 1.5 billion acres of intact forest in the northern part, in the boreal forest of Canada. And this here shows in the darkest green the areas that were protected when the campaign started in the mid-2000s. These are the amount of areas that were protected from 2000 and 2004 through the campaign and the partner groups that worked with the campaign, and those are the areas shown in red. From 2000 in 2005, we got an additional 10.5 million acres of protection. In 2006, an additional 2.4. 2007, another 38 million. Again, these are incremental gains in different areas, kind of going for the more of a traditional name it and save it approach of really finding the places that were the crown jewels that had support and gaining protection for them through the provincial and the federal government. All the while, we were pushing this overall policy for the 50% conservation, and that really took off in 2008 when Premier McGuinty of Ontario signed on to the principles of the framework and called for the protection of 50% of all of the intact forests in the boreal in the province of Ontario. And it's cross-hatched there because the exact which 50% will be protected is going to be the result of long-term land use planning, but 50% of the area that's cross-hatched will eventually be permanently protected. And that was followed shortly thereafter the next year in Quebec, which is where I do most of my work, and that is the area that's cross-hatched there will also be 50% of that area will be protected. And Quebec has recently launched a land use conservation planning process, which is called the Plan Nord. It's a multi-stakeholder planning process that is addressing land conservation on really, I think, a historically unprecedented scale. The area that's covered by this land use planning process is about twice the size of the state of Texas, or as we say when we're in Quebec, about twice the size of the country of France. And 50% of that area will be permanently protected, and there will be sustainable development standards set up on the other 50%. And it's really an exciting process to work on because, coming from my experience working in the U.S. and watching other campaigns in other places, generally we try to protect one place at a time while industry fights those protections. Industry tries to develop one place at a time while the conservation conservation is fight those developments, and at the end of it, we wind up with a shattered mirror of a landscape with broken pieces and protected pieces mixed kind of haphazardly, more due to politics than ecology. And what we're hoping for here is to create a conservation context where enough areas and the right areas can be protected in an interconnected landscape protection scheme so that development and sustainable development can happen in the other areas in a way that protects the overall integrity of the landscape. Over here is a close-up of the areas that are going to be protected in Ontario. This next slide is just for scale, something that shows the size of Quebec, which is pretty close to the size of Alaska, or 2 Texases, or 2 Frances. A close-up of the map of the area under the jurisdiction of the Plan Nord in Quebec. And here's a slide that was put out by the government of Quebec on the Plan Nord. There's a quote here. I actually should have replaced it by a more recent quote that I think is really great that the Minister of Natural Resources just put out on their website. And it says, the Plan Nord is designed as an exemplary sustainable development project. The initiatives, processes, and projects that will be launched under the plan will integrate the requirements of environmental protection and biodiversity conservation. They will introduce an approach that takes into account specific features of northern ecosystems and the concerns expressed by the Inuit, Cree, James Bay, Naskapi, Innu, Saguenay, Lac Saint Jean, and North Shore communities. And to be doing work on this scale with this amount of protection, working in close collaboration with Aboriginal communities, government, and industry is really a project that it's much larger and much broader in scope than anything I really could have ever hoped to work on in my life. In Quebec, we set up a sister organization to the Boreal Leadership Council, bringing together different First Nations conservation organizations as well as industries that work in Quebec so that we can work together to find a solution set for protection and development and make things easier for the government. In the U.S., I got very used to hearing the government tell us that if at the end of the day everybody engaged in a process is unhappy, then they must have done a good job. And what we're hoping to come out of here is at the end of the day, if everyone is happy, then they did a good job. And we think we're working in a landscape that's large enough to really have the kind of win-win that we'd like to see. We're trying to advance scientific criteria for the protection of the areas so that we're choosing the right areas, not just the areas where there isn't development potential, so that we can really protect the ecological integrity of the ecosystem over the long term. And at the end of the day, just to show the kind of scale of the thing that we're working on, which is, I guess, both some degree of bragging, but some degree of my own reminding myself of how historically significant and how intimidating this whole project is. This shows just the commitment in Quebec compared to the entirety of the U.S. National Forest System and the U.S. National Park System. And this is, if you take a look at the degrees of sustainable development versus full conservation of 50-50 compared to the level on the U.S. National Forest System and on the U.S. National Park System. And then I think the next slide, is for the overall target for our work in Quebec compared to the conservation that we've gotten in the U.S. and on the National Forest System and the National Park System. So at the end of the day, we hope to have 50% conservation and 50% protection on 1.5 billion acres, and then I hope to go on sabbatical for a little bit.
Terrific presentation, Matt. Let me ask all of the listeners out there, and we still have 74 of you paying close attention to what we're talking about, to send in questions to the moderator, to me, so that I can, we're getting feedback again, so that I can, all right, the feedback's gone, offer them to the presenters. I will begin with one, which is for Matt Jacobson, which is, Matt, how do you imagine, because this Plan Nord is still being devised, how do you imagine that you will be able to use sustainable development criteria across such a large area to deliver measurable results? Let me give you an example. You've got forest land that in the northern part of Quebec, Ontario, Newfoundland, so on, that some of it's crown land, Some of it's First Nation or Aboriginal or what we would call Indian land in the United States. Some of it's owned by mining companies or other private interests. How are you imagining that you will manage for sustainability across all of those parcels so that you reach the scientific criteria that you've outlined in your presentation?
Well, I'll start by saying it won't be easy. There's a lot of different competing interests, but there is a great degree of there's a great degree of power held by the provincial government. So they can do a lot of this, but of course in a political process they can only do it with the right degree of support. And so what we're trying to do is build a community consensus across all of those different interest levels so that the federal government can achieve what it wants to achieve. The provincial government can achieve these goals in a way that it feels largely supported by the public and perhaps more importantly by the marketplace. I think that part of this is being done out of a motivation to do the right thing, but part of it is also done in the belief that if they do the right thing, that there will be rewards on the international marketplace. And Quebec would like to position itself as being one of the most environmentally friendly producers of natural resources as well as energy, and they believe that if they do the right thing environmentally, that the markets will recognize them and it will be the right thing economically as well. And this is a philosophy that the environmental community has been positing for a long time, that if you do things ecologically right, that you will also benefit economically. And if someone is willing to try that out on a scale this large, we'd like to invest a lot in them succeeding. Part of the thing that helps drive the process so that we can bring all of the different interests together is there's a big cultural difference between Canada and the U.S. And the best way that I can explain it is that if you look at the image of the founding of the United States and the settling of the land, the image is of one man on a horse on his own against nature, the rugged individual protecting himself and looking out for himself. And that has its influence, I think, on the way that we do politics in this country. In Canada, the equivalent model is not one man on a horse, but a lot of people in a canoe. And there is a cultural consciousness that if we're going to get anywhere, we all need to be in the boat paddling at the same time. So there's a great impetus for everyone to be working together to try to achieve common consensus to get where the nation wants to go, which is makes it a little easier to work on projects of this scale than it is in the U.S.
Matt, let me follow that up with a question from William Holgren, who asks, is third-party certification important to your sustainable development criteria and ambitions? And if so, which third-party forest certification schemes are important?
Well, we definitely are working very hard on driving the different companies towards certification, and a lot of those companies have already made broad strides towards certification. There's a lot more of it going on in Canada than there is, certainly proportionally, than there is in the U.S. And when we talk about sustainable development criteria for the other 50%, we are talking about for timber operation certification. And I think that the FSC really is the gold standard internationally, but we don't rule out other certification models provided that they meet the criteria on the landscape that meets the goals of the land use planning process. So we are looking towards certification. We do look very favorably on FSC, but we aren't ruling out other ones provided that they meet the necessary criteria for protecting the landscape.
All right, now a question for Matt Zeiper first, and then you again, from Jane Wynn out in western Massachusetts. Hello, Jane. She asks, how do we create landscape-level linkages from BOREAL, Quebec, through Vermont into Massachusetts? That's an ambitious question, but I know it's one that pops up in conversation over and over and over again.
Oh boy. I do know there's a lot of activity taking place with conservationists out in Western Mass on the Q2C,
Quabbin to
Cardigan effort. The different, and we talk about working at kind of a landscape scale, and we're, at least with this example in Massachusetts, I mentioned the Community Preservation Act. there's a whole realm of other sources of funding working collaboratively, from state agencies to the U.S. Forest Service, programs like the Forest Legacy Program, programs like the addition through the Land and Water Conservation Fund to national forests, Green Mountain National Forest, for example. Private conservation work that private timber companies are working with groups like the Nature Conservancy and the Trust for Public Land. Efforts for community forests where the TPL has been very involved, and the Quebec Labrador Foundation has been involved in the policy end of creating new town forests like we created 100 years ago in New England, where sustainable timber harvesting is supporting the acquisition of hundreds and thousands of acres. I think it's that combination of individual actors working in some umbrella, which is what this Quebec to Cardigan effort is endeavoring. It's not an effort that I'm directly involved in, but one I know about. That gets the closest to part of that landscape.
All right, good. Matt Jacobson, as somebody who actually lives in central Massachusetts and I'm sure has heard these same questions begin to emerge over and over again, how in your own mind, although I know there's no definitive answer, do we create landscape level linkages from Quebec all the way to southern New England?
Well, first of all, thanks for the question, Jane, and I also want to thank Jane Wynn and other people on this call. I know that Bill Levitt is on with Highstead and Michael Hart of Landvest, as well as you, Jim, and Matt for putting so much time and energy into protecting the landscape where I live while I'm off in the wilds of Canada. I always wish that I could get more engaged in the area where I live. It's tough to live one place and protect another when so much is going on. So thank you guys for all of your efforts here. I am personally very interested in how we link these landscapes. My project is working pretty exclusively on the BOREAL, but we do put time and energy on the side into some of the efforts that are going on to link the two. And I know that there's the work that's being done by Two Countries, One Forest with the Nature Conservancy. I've been in meetings and worked together with them, with the folks at Wildlands and Woodlands that Harvard is putting together, as well as Ducks Unlimited, which is cross-boundary. And there's a lot of interest from the government in Quebec as well on working in the southern forest. We recently got them to raise their goal for protected areas from 8% in the southern part of Quebec to 12%, which is really dramatic. I mean, this is an area that's very heavily populated. So they're working on that protection, and they're also working on it with an eye towards linking those areas to the areas that are protected in the U.S. And so we're really hoping to see a lot of forward movement on that in Quebec in the coming years, and working together with Ducks Unlimited and with Harvard's Wildlands and Woodlands and the Nature Conservancy and other groups to work on the long term on linking those areas up to I guess what I would call in Canada the Southern Appalachians, but I guess they're the Northern Appalachians here.
Matt, I'm sorry, I was muted. I'll throw you one more question, which comes from Rebecca, and I don't have a fuller name than that, who asks, how do tar sands development activities play in or threaten the forests that you're concerned with? How do you address this with your corporate partners, your First Nation partners, and with governments that have jurisdiction in the boreal forest?
Well, the tar sands are, it's hard not to say quite a sticky problem. The tar sands are a giant issue that we face and immensely threatening to the boreal forests in Alberta. And there's a lot of support for tar sand development from the federal government. There's a lot of money there. And that's being dealt with. There are other campaigns we work really closely with that are working on the tar sand issue. We are working, our goal is to really bring together, I guess we see ourselves in our work in the boreal forest more as conveners than anything else, bringing together conservation interests with First Nation interests and industry interests, rather than just an aggressive advocacy group, but we do see an important need for that aggressive advocacy to be done. And we work with others who are doing that advocacy work around the tar sands, and it really is one of the biggest trouble spots, but it's one that we're actually putting a little bit less energy into because that battle is still being waged by others. But it is quite an impediment to landscape level protection in that region.
Okay, I have one more question for each of the mats, and then I think we'll conclude this session. We try to keep this to about an hour, and we have had an hour of very interesting discussion, I think, that opens up this subject of cross-cutting conservation strategies on very large scales. The question comes from Dennis Canty, and it specifically pertains to Plan Nord, but Matt Zyper, I'd like you to think of it in a Massachusetts context as well. And the question is, how are the goals of Plan Nord ensured against changes in the environmental interests of future provincial governments? And I would say of future governments at a national level and probably at a local level as well.
There's a joke in Canada about how every 4 years they elect a new dictator. So there is always a problem in Canada of the amount of power that both provincial and federal governments have. But the best way to protect against things is to have large buy-in from the communities, from the interested parties, by the people who are most affected. If people are supportive of the results of a project, then the durability of it is ensured. If it's done by a powerful government over the objections of the people who are most affected, then nothing can last. And I think that's true in Canada and everywhere else. But also, there's the rule of law, and having these things legislated in the long run is very important to their sustainability.
Matt Zyper.
One of the critical components that I can't believe I overlooked to the success of the Community Preservation Act is an active, broad-based group called the Community Preservation Coalition, about 6 or 8 member organizations that actively work to help communities both adopt and implement the law. The presence of the support of CPA in 142 cities and towns across the state allows it to have the community level support to keep the act in place without the legislature tinkering with it year in and year out.
So I will also add in there that I love that question because it allows me to click through the 5 characteristics of landmark conservation initiatives, and I would say both of these efforts are candidates for going down in the history books. Those 5 criteria are that the ideas are novel, that they're strategically significant, that they're measurably effective, that they're transferable from one jurisdiction to another, and most importantly in the context of this question, that they are enduring. And that's really the big challenge because, of course, the conservation community is a community of practice which is trying to do something for the very long term. And we have days that are discouraging and days that are encouraging. I would hope that all of you felt like this was a day that was encouraging. You have people here talking about a law that in 10 years has captured maybe 40% of the communities in Massachusetts' heart, as well as one in Canada that has commitments to protect 400 million acres of wildlands and woodlands. So that's on a global scale, that's a very, very large number. Both of these achievements, I think, are ones that deserve recognition and probably further study and replication so that we can continue over the next decades and generations and centuries to conserve the landscape of North America and beyond. So with that, I will thank all of you for tuning in again to another of these internet broadcasts. We will be back in the spring when my great hope is that the sun is shining in Cambridge, Massachusetts, with another talk from a pair of conservation finance and conservation innovation standouts. Have a very good day, and we'll talk to you soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you.